Well, once again, welcome. I'd like to get a little sense of the room. How many of you are parishioners here at St. Francis of Assisi? So that's your connection. How many of you are members of the Thomas Merton Society? We've got at least one. All right. So I can fake it. It's on the line. And others, well, okay, I won't ask how everybody got here, but you certainly are welcome. Some of course, from my own parish and Zendo and groups that I know already. So what are we doing tonight? Well, we're talking about Thomas Merton, and there are a couple of relatively young people in the room. But as you see, most of us are of a slightly more advanced age in this world, and that's typical, I think. I doubt if there are many, 25, 30-year-old Catholics who've even heard of Thomas Merton. Hopefully I'm wrong about that. But it is certainly a figure that we shouldn't forget. I would say Thomas Merton among American Catholics of the 20th century is, along with Dorothy Day, maybe Fulton Sheen, arguably the most important figure. And certainly, if we're talking about for the life of prayer, for spreading the doctrine of contemplation, making it more popular, in the days before the centering prayer movement and Thomas Keating, etc., certainly Thomas Merton is a towering figure. And speaking of towering and overwhelming, his output as a writer is intimidating. I doubt there have been many who've read all of his works, maybe some. No one could possibly read all the stuff that's been written about him, all the doctoral theses and all the stuff that's been written. My reaction sometimes to that is, well, stop, be inspired by him, of course, read what he has to say, but then don't write theses, Launch into the adventure yourself, and somebody will write a doctoral thesis about you someday. Find out who you are, which is really what Thomas Merton's journey is about. This ties in, therefore, if you like, to the talks I gave last summer here, last August, on the life and death adventure of prayer. Some of you were here for that. There I was talking about, if you recall, and it's on my website as well, thanks to Judy, this will be too, in case you can't make all 3 days, and in case you care about that. There I was talking about the actual adventure of prayer, the process of prayer, the different types of prayer that are available to us in the various traditions and within the Catholic tradition. Today, using Merton as an example, a very, I think, eloquent and outstanding example, we're talking about the process of spiritual evolution. And I think his life is a very good example. Now, a couple of caveats here. A, who am I to talk about Thomas Merton? All right, well, I'm certainly not a Merton scholar. I don't have any degree in Merton studies. I grew up in a religious life. I was a young Jesuit when I first read Merton, and reading him as he was publishing, as he was coming out in the mid and late 60s. So I was reading it there, and I was a Jesuit novice at the time that he died, and all caught up in the spiritual life as I was. His death affected me and my young brothers in the Jesuits very profoundly. So we kind of grew up with him. And he's, well, as I said in my blurb for the brochure for these lectures, I'm an Archdiocesan priest, but I'm also a former Carthusan monk and a Zen sensei. In fact, my Zendo, Dragon's Eye Zendo, meets in this very room on Thursdays. This Thursday we'll be talking about Merton and Zen, among other things, so that fits in very well. And I said, those are two things that Thomas Merton very much wanted to be. Now that might sound a little snotty, but it's true. I had a certain affinity for knowing what Merton's world, ambiance was, because I was not only a contemplative monk, a monastic for 22 years, he was a monk for 27, but in an order in which he aspired to become a member for a certain period of time in his younger monastic life. And I'll have some inside info about what the Carthusans thought about that, as we speak today. But also, he became very fascinated. This we'll be talking about on Thursday. Became in his later monastic life very interested in Eastern religions, and particularly in Zen. He didn't become a teacher, but I can certainly speak to that as a Zen teacher, having become interested in that and other Eastern forms of prayer, which we actually talked about last year. Even so, with those qualifications such as they are, I want to make a few caveats. No one can systematize anybody's life, much less someone as important and as public and as complicated, very complicated, as Thomas Merton. I don't want to seem like I'm pigeonholing or oversimplifying his life, even if when we use certain categories to try and situate him. But with that caution, I will try to do so. Also, especially someone like Merton, who was complicated and very smart, you'll get an intimation of one thing or a pronouncement of something in an earlier stage, which he will only later really digest and make real in his life on a more existential level. So it's a little hard to pick and choose quotes from here and there to prove points, and one can always find a quote that might refute or qualify and nuance the point I'm trying to make, and that's part of the complication, the beauty of the human life, and so I don't want to detract from that either. Nonetheless, I think I do have perhaps something to offer here. I do interfaith work, and I've done interfaith work with a number of people, including Robert Toth, who from 1998 to 2010 was the executive director of the Merton Center for Contemplative Living in Louisville, and he still is involved in Merton work. And I told him about this particular approach that I had to show his spiritual evolution, and he said, nobody's ever really done that before. Why don't you write that up and give it to one of the Merton seminars or annual meetings, but we have to do that like 3 years in advance. So I'm going to stick with this, and hopefully it'll be of profit to people. So with all of that, I'd like to say we have 3 nights, and those are 3 phases of Merton's life. And it does fit fairly neatly. As I just said, you can't really fit anything neatly, but into the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. Basically those periods of Merton's life. And tonight, we're going to be talking about the 1940s and his early monastic life, culminating in his great masterpiece, his classic autobiography, The Seven-Story Mountain. I've been referring to the Sign of Jonas as well, which the diary of his monastic life, which he began during those years. As I said, it fit in my blurb. His life fits both classic, ancient, and more modern divisions of the spiritual life in a very intriguing fashion. The primary and most classic one goes back to the 3rd century and origin, father of the church, and actually beyond, we think into the Gnostic tradition of all things. But even St. Paul uses some of those categories, so it shouldn't be anathema. Where you have, and this, in Merton's own time, I should say, a book that I read, Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, who was an early 20th century Dominican theologian and ascetical writer, called The 3 Ages of the Spiritual Life. So we're talking about the first of those 3 ages, which in the ancient category is called beginners, and the purgative way. The Carmelites use this as well. I mean, these became classic and Catholic ascetical and mystical theology, formal theology. So we're talking about the time of beginners and of purgation. Now, those early years, obviously there was those early years in the 30s, and even earlier that Thomas Merton speaks about in his autobiography, those wild years, intellectually and socially in other ways, of Merton. You say precede his spiritual life, and they lead into it as part of the purgation process. But the actual formal beginning, of his spiritual life is when he converts and then is baptized. And that begins, the formal process of the spiritual life within the Catholic tradition. Now, what characterizes a person's early purgative way, and in fact, one could even say, using more modern categories, a young man's journey, in general, but especially in the spiritual life, according to Richard Rohr, which I'm going to be explaining in a moment, is the ascent, the heroic journey, as it's been called by Jungians and others. It's seeking for one's place in the world, one's identity, one's mental universe, one's situation in the world. And it involves promises and commitments and adopting a whole, as I say, worldview and lifestyle, finding your place in the world. And for Merton and for those who follow in the religious life and the priesthood, that's what it was. He engaged with the monastery, with the Cistercian life, and his solemn profession and priesthood, and we'll be looking at that more in a moment. And very much took on the vocabulary and the worldview of the theological world of Catholicism in the 1940s and 50s too, as well. And going back to read some of Merton in The Seven-Storey Mountain and elsewhere, his activities, his intellectual activities, the books he was reading, and later the persons he was corresponding with, it's a thumbnail presentation of the Catholic intellectual world of the 1940s, largely dominated. And I remember this for myself when I was, reading, my early Jesuit life, reading in that universe. I've already mentioned Garou-Lagrange, you had Maritain, Gilson, largely the French, you had Chenu, you had Gardet, you had the Cardinal, later Cardinal, Danielou and Lubac, Septiange, another great French intellectual school theologian. So he was reading all of this, and it's a whole theological world in which the categories are very well settled based on St. Thomas Aquinas, and it's kind of a juggling and nuancing, dancing with these concepts that have been elaborated over a number of centuries, and he feels very comfortable juggling and dancing around in that universe. Of course, it has its limitations, which we'll be talking about, because then I remember as a young Jesuit, I said to myself, this is great stuff. This has got such coherence and majesty and persuasiveness and cogency, but don't we risk painting ourselves into a corner? I mean, do we really think that theology and the infinite God can this is it? This is the only way we can talk about it? So that's part of the danger of entering into that universe which is so well codified. And believe me, Catholicism in the 1950s was very well codified. So much so that people want to go back to it now. And that's part of the journey as well. And I'll come back to that point towards the end of the evening. But to return to this notion of the ascent, you take on the commitment, the institution, the mental universe, the whole thing, and you help that define you. And it's an ascent because you're finding your place in your ego's place in the world, basically your personal individual sense in the world. And it's a climb, in that sense. And of course, isn't it intriguing that it's called the 7-story mountain? Because he's climbing a mountain. And I'm not sure it's clear in the book somewhere, maybe you could point it out, but it's actually a reference to Dante. The 7-story mountain is from the Divine Comedy with the Mount of Purgatory. It's a 7-story mountain of purgatory, the Purgatorio. So we're beyond the hell and all that, unbridled passion and uncontrolled impulse, which is Merton in the 30s. And so once you get to the 40s, we're on the Mount of Purgatory and we're going through our monastic purgation, the purgative way, the beginner's way, starting on the path. And it's a climb up the mountain, even according to, what about the ascent of Mount Carmel, John of the Cross? It's the same imagery, of almost spiritual achievement, spiritual athleticism, to forge, your habits and your personality and your character in these contexts. But it is also important to realize that purgatory was just the beginning. Right? Purgatory is not the end of the Divine Comedy. When you reach the earthly paradise, overcoming the 7 stories, by the way, are the 7 capital sins, and you're overcoming those if you're familiar with the Purgatorio, which is really what Merton is talking about here. The monastic life is allowing him to overcome, or at least bridle, it's probably more accurate, those impulses and enter into a spiritual formation process, the purgative way. So that's really what's going on in those years. And part of the temptation is that once you adopt and adapt yourself to these institutions and worldviews, and you've got a whole life program and process engaged, as I say, you can think that's the end of the journey. And many people do stop there. They think that's the end. And we'll come back to that issue in a moment when we talk about one of the other modern presentations of the spiritual journey, which I'll mention already here now. It's called The Stages of Faith by James Fowler, published all the way back in 1980. But it speaks about the different levels of faith and types of faith. Faith in the broad secular sense as well. Whatever you put your sense of value and power, where you get your power, what your vision of the world is, what gives you your meaning and your identity, that doesn't have to be religious. There's always kind of a certain faith in life, and faith in God, whatever it might be, that moves people on. And he points out, he speaks about especially six levels, and stages of development, stages of faith, intuitive, projective faith, and mythical, literal faith, what you get in younger people or younger mentalities. Some people never get beyond that in primitive cultures sometimes. But the third stage, he speaks about synthetic, conventional faith. And that's what we're talking about here. When you've got a clear, formulated worldview and institutions and the whole thing that seems to be a perfectly adequate program for life. And many people never move beyond that. In other words, it's say that the Catholic that grew up Catholic in wherever it might be in the culture, Irish, German, Italian, Polish, and never questioned or never moves beyond that worldview of the catechism and the formulations that they received and the cultural givens and presuppositions and even biases. And it just fits and never really knocked out with that. Now it's important to note, as he does, that doesn't necessarily mean you're limited to that level of holiness. You're limited to that level of worldview, of synthetic vision of faith, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your holiness can't move beyond that. And he gives some very good examples of that at some point here in the book. He says, the very people that Merton looked to, for example, John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Jesus, they never moved beyond synthetic, conventional faith, level 3 faith. Didn't stop them from becoming saints and from leading profound spiritual lives. But on the level of their worldview, they never evolved beyond that. And it's not their fault. It's not even a limitation, really. Because how on earth could you expect anybody in 16th century imperial Spain to move beyond the Catholic worldview, especially in the face of the Protestant Reformation, which was going on in the neighboring countries? Holy shit. No wonder there was no way that they could there was no influence from the outside to move them beyond that. As you know, St. Teresa of Jesus, always, almost consistently and constantly refers to God as His Majesty. Well, that's Philip II. I mean, God is the king, okay, fine, but to be in that particular choice of worldview is largely a cultural phenomenon, socio-political and all these other things. Another good example is the other Teresa, Teresa of Lisieux. There was no way she could possibly move beyond the worldview that she got as a bourgeoisie French woman in the late 19th century. And that brought her to a crisis of faith towards the end of her life, as you know, but it didn't prevent her from not only becoming holy, but being a doctor of the church, because she had spiritual wisdom which came from elsewhere, almost in spite of the limitations of her worldview, but also through them. So it's just curious. So here we have Thomas Merton, who achieves solemn profession, priesthood, and publication of his autobiography, and that itself is revealing. A person who's 33 years old writes his autobiography because he made it. This is it. This is who he was, according to what he really believed. He achieved it. Even though he said it's by God's grace, and of course it was, but nonetheless, wow, it's my identity. I'm a Trappist monk, and I'm a priest, and I'm a Catholic, and this is it. 33 years. I remember when I was a young monk, I was in the Carthusans at the time, and I remember when I was 33, I wrote the introduction to my autobiography. Which thankfully I never wrote. But I had the same temptation, the same impulse, because I had been solemnly professed and ordained a priest, and here I was, and I found my place in the world, and why not tell the world about it? But it's just the beginning. It's just the first part of the journey. And there are and have been many people who never get past that, including religious and priests and nuns, not to mention lay people who, well, this is my identity, and it's true and good, which it is, so I don't need anything else. I don't need to go any further. But that's the tendency. I'm going to exemplify, through quotes here from the Seven-Story Mountain and from the Slide of Jonah, both the limitations and the beauty of what Merton discovered, what we can discover in the tradition as we have it, and see exemplified both as I say, the excellence and beauty of it, and also in some cases the naivete of it. And this will be an example of what I'm pointing out. Just want to point a couple of the points that James Fowler makes on the Stages of Faith on the synthetic conventional faith is that whereas people seem to choose this whole worldview and the way of the language and everything else, the symbol system and everything, it's really the symbol system that chooses them. It's given. It comes with the whole package, and it's not really assimilated in a critical fashion. It's just received. And I say people tend not to change from that. This is especially true of converts like Merton. And if you know converts, into say Catholicism later in life, wow, they've overcome the world and all their past, folly, and now they have the truth. Wow, and they're never going to let go of a single syllable of it, because wow, this is it, and it is beautiful and it is true, but it's still just the beginning. So it's a special temptation with converts like Merton. And we'll see how he didn't stop there, but it is, that would be kind of natural and normal. And the other thing that he points out very well is that there's a tendency here, and I mentioned the whole worldview of Catholicism, which was so settled and so complete, like a big palace, that one tends to identify the truth itself with the formulation and with the institution, with the church or the monastery, whatever part of it. And that's a fundamental error. The truth itself, God, Christ, is not coterminous with a particular formulation, doctrinal formulation, or institutional living presentation of it. And the tendency is, just to identify the truth itself with the church or the formula, or even the country, God and country and that kind of thing. And that we will see in Merton. So one of the features that Richard Rohr points out on this first half of the journey, actually, he says age 1 to 32. He says in this book, The Wild Man's Journey. Richard Rohr presents that first half of life, said age 1 to 32, and that's exactly what Merton was, age 33, when he wrote that concluding autobiography. A couple of features of that is that there's first of all, there's a strong engagement, there's a black and white worldview, very commonly. This is the truth, and this is bad. Very clear. So we can make clear choices, and clear understanding. There's not a lot of nuance, in the worldview and in the presentation. And the couple of other features. Of course, it's very idealistic. You tend to I'm going to show you some good examples of that. You tend to idealize the institution or whatever it is you're engaging with in a very noticeable way. One thing he says, which is interesting, we're not in love with God, but in love with the idea of being in love with God. You can probably find that not only in Merton, but probably in us all. But in those early idealistic years, you so want to love God. You're always talking about loving God, but you're not loving God. You're loving the idea of loving God. An interesting filter in which to read some of what Merton writes in these years. Not necessarily the case, but it's something to keep in mind. It can be, as we see also with some young people today in the church, it can be a very dangerous kind of righteous, black and white worldview which comes out. Some of that is seen in some of the that black and white, in some of what Merton writes. For example, in Harlem, and there's on page 421 in this is actually a 1970 edition. Wow, from a 7-story mountain, just falling apart in my hands. I think it belonged to my dad. On Judgment Day, the citizens of that fat metropolis with its mighty buildings and its veins bursting with dollars and its brains overreaching themselves with new optimistic philosophies of culture and progress will be surprised, astounded when they find out who it was that was keeping the brimstone and thunderbolts of God's anger from wiping them long since from the face of the earth. Sounds like Occupy Wall Street. And that's kind of like Old Testament prophecy, right? I mean, it's, in other words, there's part of truth to it. And it's not entirely wrong, but it's black and white, and it's not the most mature thing. Interesting, Richard Rohr says that even about John the Baptist, and he's right. Anyone who's talking about fire and brimstone, as John the Baptist does, is at an entry level of spirituality. It was this mission, and there's truth to it, just as we said earlier about the worldview and all of that, but it's just the first step. And proof of that is what Jesus himself says. No one greater than John the Baptist, but the least in the kingdom of God is greater than he. Because he could understand the deeper compassion and mercy and the hidden mystery of what's really going on, and the paradoxes and subtleties of people's lives and of the world. And which is why also, do you remember, John the Baptist sent a message to Jesus from prison, as we read every Advent, saying, wait a minute, are you the one that we're supposed to be waiting for? Where's the fire and brimstone? So, all I'm saying is that it's a mark of a fairly immature spirituality. And there are some other good examples of this. One of the poems of Merton, a couple of poems of Merton from the 1947, is called Visions of an Apocalypse, Visions for an Apocalypse. There you go. Okay. You're right there. And the sixth canto, so to speak, of that poem is In the Ruins of New York. The moon is paler than an actress and weeps for you, New York, seeking to see you through the tattered bridges, leaning down to catch the sham brass of your sophisticated voice and songs are heard no more. Sounds like the lament over Babylon in the book of Revelation, if you read that. Oh, how quiet it is after the black night when flames out of the clouds burn down your cariated teeth, and when those lightnings, lancing the black boils of Harlem and the Bronx, spill the remaining prisoners, the tens and twenties of the living, into the trees of Jersey, to the green farms, to find their liberty. How are they down? How have they fallen down, those great strong towers of ice and steel? Sounds like 9/11, actually. And melted by what terror and what miracle? What fires and lights tore down? With the white anger of their sudden accusation, those towers of silver and of steel. You whose streets grew up on trellises with roots in Bowling Green and taproots in the Upper Bay, how are you stripped now to your skeleton? What has become of your live and dead flesh? Where is the shimmer of your body leaves? Where are your children in the evening of your final Sunday, gunned after one another in the shadows of the Paramount? The ashes of the leveled towers still curl with tufts of smoke, veiling your obsequies in their incinerating haze. They write in embers this your epitaph. This again sounds like Revelation 15. This was a city that dressed herself in paper money. She lived 400 years with nickels running in her veins. She loved the waters of the seven purple seas and burned on her own green harbor, higher and whiter than ever any Tyre, the city of Tyre. She was as callous as a taxi. Her high-heeled eyes were sometimes blue as gin, and she nailed them all the days of her life through the hearts of her 6 million poor. And she has died in the terrors of a sudden contemplation, drowned in the waters of her own, her poisoned well. Speaking about Christ in the Eucharist, in the seven-story mountain, in the early pages. I did not even know who Christ was, that he was gone. I had not the faintest idea that there existed such a thing as the Blessed Sacrament. And yet now I tell you, you who are now what I once was, unbelievers, it is that sacrament and that alone, the Christ living in our midst and sacrificed by us and for us and with us in the clean and perpetual sacrifice, it is He alone who holds our world together and keeps us all from being poured headlong and immediately into the pit of our eternal destruction. And I tell you, there is a power that goes forth from that sacrament, a power of light and truth, even into the hearts of those who have heard nothing of Him and seem to be incapable of belief. Probably not wrong, but on the other hand, who would write such a thing? Well, the person who's enthusiastic and totally taken up by that first fervor of discovering the truth of the Eucharist, the truth of Christ, the truth of Catholicism. Just the first step. And what he has to say here finally about Catholic schools and Catholic education. I'm overwhelmed at the thought of the tremendous weight of moral responsibility that Catholic parents accumulate upon their shoulders by not sending their children to Catholic schools. Those who are not of the Church have no understanding of this. They can't be expected to. As far as they can see, all this insistence on Catholic schools is only a money-making device by which the Church is trying to increase its domination over the minds of men. And of course, most non-Catholics imagine that the Church is immensely rich. Is it any wonder that there can be no peace in a world where everything possible is done to guarantee that the youth of every nation will grow up absolutely without moral and religious discipline, without the shadow of an interior life, or of that spirituality and charity and faith which alone can safeguard the treaties and agreements made by governments? Again, maybe not false, but wow, what a style. Now, speaking of idealism, his view of monastic life, just before he went into it, and especially what he has to say about the Carthusians. Within the order, within the Carthusians ourselves, we always said if Merton had come to the Carthusians, he wouldn't have lasted 2 weeks, because he was a writer. There was no way he couldn't write. And even though, as you know from the 7-story mountain, he was tortured, by I should be solitary, I should be a monk, I shouldn't have contact with the world, I shouldn't be writing. But he had no way he couldn't write, and then his superiors made him write, including books that no one considers, including him, to have been very great, like the biography of Mother Berkman's, the Waters of Siloé, the history of the order. Even ascetical books like The Ascent, there we go again, The Ascent to Truth, or Life and Holiness, which, the whole vocabulary of this universe that I was talking about before is right there, without a whole lot of original inspiration, as he would be the first to say. So there was that sense of desiring a more perfect solitude. And we'll come back to that in a second. But his view of the Carthusians, he would point out that they were better in some ways, but maybe not in all ways. So maybe I have chosen the best one, the greatest one of all. Let me read a couple of passages from that towards the end. He was told by one of his superiors that, don't worry about the Carthusians, you'll get a lot more penance here. So join us, we're more penitential. Very typical of that time. So he says, he keeps talking about, O beata solitudo, o sola beatitudo, he quotes that again and again, O blessed solitude, O soul blessedness, beata solitudo, sola beatitudo. But there's one thing the Cistercians had in their favor. The Carthusians had a kind of recreation, which is true, in which they went out for walks together and conversed with one another to prevent the possibilities of strain that might go with too uncompromising a solitude, too much of that sola beatitudo. Could there be too much of it, I wonder? But the Trappists had unbroken silence, had one advantage. always trying to persuade himself that he really did choose the best. I was not allowed the luxury of speculation on this. The Carthusians were more perfect, perhaps, and therefore more to be desired, but they were doubly out of reach because of the war and because of what I thought was my lack of a vocation. And then finally, talk about idealization of the monastic life in general. Just listen to this. It's almost unbelievable. But you can understand, in order to commit yourself to a life like this, and I know this from my own experience, you have to have almost this idealist, incredible view of this is the most fantastic thing. It's so unimaginably beautiful and elevated. You kind of have to exaggerate a little bit, in your own heart and mind in order to engage with it to begin with, I would say. But he certainly did here. What wonderful happiness there was in the world. There were still men on this miserable, noisy, cruel earth who tasted the marvelous joy of silence and solitude, who dwelt in forgotten mountain cells and secluded monasteries where the news and desires and appetites and conflicts of the world no longer reached them. They were free from the burden of the flesh's tyranny. Oh yeah. And their clear vision, clean of the world's smoke and of its bitter sting, were raised to heaven and penetrated into the deeps of heaven's infinite and healing light. Really? They were poor, they had nothing, and therefore they were free and possessed everything. Okay? Everything they touched struck off something of the fire of divinity. They worked with their hands, silently plowing and harrowing the earth and sowing the seed in obscurity and reaping their small harvests. They built their own houses and made with their own hands their own furniture. Above all, they had found Christ. They knew the power and the sweetness and the depth and the infinity of His love, living and working in Him. For His love, they had thrown away everything and concealed themselves in the secret of His face. In proportion as grace emptied their hearts of creative desire, the Spirit of God entered in and filled the place that had been made for God. They tasted within them the secret glory, the hidden manna, the infinite nourishment and strength of the presence of God. They tasted the sweet exultancy of the fear of God. And all day long God spoke to them. The clean voice of God in His tremendous peacefulness, spending truth within them as simply and directly as water wells up in a spring. Really. And grace was in them suddenly, always in more and more abundance, they knew not from where. And the coming of this grace to them occupied them altogether, filled them with love and with freedom. And grace overflowing in all their acts and movements made everything they did an act of love, glorifying God not by drama, not by gesture, not by outward show, but by the very simplicity and economy of utter perfection, so utter that it escapes notice entirely. Finally, the love of Christ overflowing in those clean hearts made them children and made them eternal. Old men with limbs like the roots of trees had the eyes of children and lived under their gray wooden cowls eternal. And all of them, the young and the old, were ageless, the little brothers of God, little children from whom was made the kingdom of heaven. So that's beautiful. I mean, it's very poetic, and there's some profound truth to that, as I know from my own monastic life. But really? I mean, it's very, very, very idealized, as is characteristic of that first stage of spiritual life and of that stage of faith. Does anyone, before I continue, anyone have any questions or comments, qualifications for all of this? Yes?
What struck me as we were reading that, though, every picture I've seen of Thomas Merton, even as he got older, his eyes did have a brightness about them, an inquisitiveness and an aliveness. So he must have found that somewhere. I mean, you never looked at his face and saw like a deadness in his eyes.
That's true. As far as we know from the pictures. And from his writing, he always wrote with great vitality, no matter what stage of life he was in. And so it goes back to my point, that this is appropriate, really, for this stage of life. The danger, of course, is that you get stuck there in this kind of idealism, and then and inevitably falls apart, then you fall apart. And that didn't happen to Merton. But it is naive. I mean, it is naive. But, you know, it's kind of characteristic of that first stage of the spiritual journey, which is exemplified by Merton here.
I'm sorry, you know, I missed the absolute beginning of the talk. You said you wanted to be what? When you began, if you recall your remark that you knew what you wanted to be?
Yes, a Carthusan and a Zen teacher.
That's what he wanted to be?
Well, sure, he wanted to be. As we just heard, you know, where he wanted to become a Carthusan.
Do you think it was good that the Franciscans turned him down?
He was what?
Didn't he apply to the Franciscans?
Well, you know the story. You know, they turned him down as part of the seven-story mountain. It seems because he confessed his affair, you know, with fathering a child in England when he was there. But whatever the reason, then they could see he wasn't made for that. And then, you know, he doubted his vocation at all for a while, and that's part of the drama here.
I wonder if that was fortuitous, if he would have made a bad Franciscan.
Wow. He would have overflowed any religious order that he was in, as any fully developed person, individuated person does. That's for later in the talk. Yes?
You know, you didn't tell me that the piece about New York was from Merton. I was listening. I was going to say Allen Ginsberg. It sounds like the Beats.
Or yeah, as I say, or the modern day Occupy Wall Street. You know, there's certainly some truth to it. You know. But it's characteristic of a certain level of awareness, how God works in the world. Anyone else? I wanted to also read part of the sign of Jonah. He speaks of the his profession in here, or actually he doesn't. You know, if you go back, he made solemn profession as a Cistercian on March 19th, the feast of St. Joseph in 1947, and his autobiography was published the next year in 48. But he says, you know, leading up to on profession itself, March 18th he says, tomorrow is my profession day. March 20th he said, yesterday I made solemn vow. There's nothing in between. And I really identify with that because, you know, it really, whether you're talking about solemn profession in monastic order or ordination to the priesthood, as we'll see in a minute, I know from my own experience of both, that you're in a whole other dimension. I mean, you can't begin to talk about what happened. Again, it's a sign that it was really an authentic experience for him. I mean, it was part of that engagement of that first stage of life. And that, you know, it was beyond words. But that's also true of his priesthood, which actually came the year after the autobiography was published. But in the sign of Jonah, then in part 4, it's called "To the Altar of God." And here you see, you know, this sense of just how important and life-defining, and rightly so, it is. The priesthood was for him. And as part of that initial engagement, that enthusiastic taking on of his identity and of his mission in the world, he says, the greatest thing that happens is the most ordinary. He says that no man is ordained priest for himself alone. So he's aware of this being a mission, you know, for the whole church. He says, my priestly ordination was, I felt, this is the introduction to part 4, my priestly ordination was, I felt, the one great secret for which I had been born. So any priest can relate to that, but he really experienced that. For me, I realized 10 years before that ordination to the priesthood was in fact a matter of life and death. It's who he was really meant to be. This is called a perfect meeting with the inscrutable will of God. Mercy and a secret which was so purely mine that at first I intended to speak of them to no one. And in fact, again, the same thing happened, as we'll see in a second, with his priesthood. So the grace of my priesthood, the greatest of my life, was to me something far greater than a momentary flight above the monotonous lowlands of an everyday existence. That moment is. it permanently transformed my ordinary everyday life, which it does. It transforms your whole existence. After my first Mass, I understood perfectly and for the first time in my life that nothing else in the world is important except to love God and to serve Him with simplicity and joy. I live now, not I, but Christ lives in me, he quotes Galatians. What is easier than to let God live in you and to love Him who loves you? Well, theoretically, yes. So, in the days leading up to his ordination in 1949, I remember reading this before I was ordained. I read these passages a couple of weeks before I was ordained priest in the monastery, and I could really identify with them. He says, "It seems to me impossible that I should live the next 2.5 weeks without keeling over, dying of heart failure, or having the house come down on top of my head. How can I possibly achieve such a wonder as the priesthood? To do the one thing that saves the world and brings health into it and makes men capable of being happy. To continue the mystery of Christ's death and resurrection and do all those simple and easy things by which the work of our redemption is accomplished." So a beautiful enthusiasm, and almost can't believe that he's actually being called to such a thing. And yet you see the formulas are very traditional. The language is, as I pointed out. Not wrong, I'm just saying that they're very much part of the package. And then he mentions several things about the priesthood as he goes along. I cannot explain more at the moment except that Christ, the high priest, is awakening in the depths of my soul in silence and majesty, like a giant who means to run his course. That's a quote from Psalm 19, talking about the sun coming out and running its course like a giant. Instead of myself and my Christ and my love and my prayer, there is the might of a prayer stronger than thunder and milder than the flight of doves, rising up from the priest who is the center of the soul of every priest, shaking the foundations of the universe and lifting up me, host, altar, sanctuary, people, church, abbey, forest, cities, continents, seas, and worlds to God and plunging everything into Him. Oh, I think he appreciates the dimensions of this priesthood. And it's very beautiful. So, going up, and again, in 3 days, if I'm alive, and if the Archbishop doesn't fall down and break his leg, I should be a priest, Can't believe it, I keep thinking, I shall say Mass, I shall say Mass. You can't read anything but John of the Cross, he says. He speaks about the poverty of the priest, and again he quotes, "To me to live is Philippians for me to live is Christ and to die is gain." On May 25th, the Vigil of the Ascension, he's preparing for that. He loves the liturgy. If you read his diary, he frequently quotes from the liturgy of the feast day, etc., which is part of the beautiful package. And then 4 days later, Sunday within the act of the Ascension, May 29th, I could not begin to write about the ordination, about saying Mass, etc. Someday it will come out retrospectively in fragments, perhaps. Exactly. It's just too overwhelming to be able to write about, especially on the day itself. A sense of the absolutely tremendous work that has been done in me and through me in the last 3 days. Ordination, anointing, ordination Mass, and the first low Mass, and what followed, the solemn Mass yesterday, etc. I am left with the feeling not only that I have been transformed, but that a new world has somehow been brought into being through the labor and happiness of these 3 most exhausting days, full of sublimity and of things that none of us will understand for a year or two to come, or ever. So, the Mass is the most wonderful thing that has ever entered my life. And at the altar, I feel that I'm at last the person that God has truly intended me to be. So, in all of this, I want to emphasize the two parts. The fact that this really is fantastic. I mean, it's beautiful and profound and deep, but that it is nonetheless, maybe for that very reason, because it is so deep, just the first step to understand it and experience it that way. it's kind of this mountaintop, and the whole universe is, is from this perspective. Special, and it is, but how does that actually work out? And I did want to point out, let me just read this understanding, this beautiful, this is right after his solemn profession, about the liturgy, how he appreciated the liturgy. The Advent hymn, Conditor Alme Siderum. What measure and balance and strength there is in the simplicity of that hymn. And it's true, by the way. Its structure is mighty, with a perfection that despises the effects of the most grandiloquent secular music, and says more than Bach, without even exhausting the whole range of one octave. Yes, absolutely. I used to say that myself. Bach is the summit of secular music, and even though you're religious music, but when you get to Gregorian chant, then you're in the depths. So I totally, identify with that. Conditor Alme Siderum, aeterna lux credentium, Christe Redemptorum meum, exaudi preces supplicum. That evening I saw how the measured tone took the old words of St. Ambrose and infused into them even more strength and suppleness and conviction and meaning than they already had. I made them flower before God in beauty and in fire, flower along the stones and vanish into darkness of the vaulted ceiling. And their echo died and left our souls full of peace and grace. And we began to chant the Magnificat and almost wept. That was because I was new in the monastery. So he recognized that, some of these exalted experiences were exactly because he was new. So, there was some awareness, of his own future evolution. And I can't resist just pointing out, he mentions a couple of things about Buddhism here in these early years, which are very much in contrast with what he says later. Talking about an author, Aldous Huxley, who had a sympathy for Buddhism and for the nihilistic character which he preferred to give to his mysticism. He said he read some books on some Oriental texts, and he got the impression mysticism was something very esoteric and complicated. We were all inside some huge being in whom we were involved, and out of whom we evolved, and the thing to do is to involve ourselves back in, by a system of elaborate disciplines. The absolute being was an infinite, timeless, peaceful, impersonal nothing. Well, that's not what he believed later. But that was basically the view that even scholars had in the 1950s in Catholicism. They didn't really know anything about Buddhism. The common view that Maritain had and Père Gardet and Heinrich de Merlin, who was also someone who wrote from experience in the East, was that the Eastern mystical experience of whatever strand, whether Buddhist or Hindu, was an experience of your own being. Kind of like a pure pluk. Falling back into your own being and having kind of a pure experience of your own essence, your own existence. And they all put that forth as the idea, which meant for them that it was entirely natural. If you had an experience of your own being, it was natural, whereas you had an experience of God and Christ, it was supernatural. Perfect illustration of what I mean by very neat categories. And everything fits into a nice category, so it's natural on some other level. So it's painting yourselves in the corner. And I totally disagree with that. And I don't think there are many people today who would still hold that. But it was part of the mental universe that he was in at the time, kind of view. And of course before Vatican II and before that decree on non-Christian religions, which brought forth their validity and started paving the way for a deeper experience and exploration of them. So there's that limitation clear in early Merton, which will then grow beyond that later on. So I thought to especially conclude that we can talk, have a little more discussion and questions. Towards the very end of the seven-story mountain, the epilogue is called Meditatio Pauperis in Solitudine, meditation of the poor man in solitude. And that actually goes back, it's a quote from the beginning of St. Bonaventure's A Journey of the Mind to God. And it's true of all of us, and we're all called we're all in our solitude and we're all poor. We can also be reflecting on our situation. He actually spends 6 whole pages discussing in pure scholastic terms, according to theology of the time, the different types of life, the active life and the contemplative life, and the mixed life, which is what Thomas Aquinas calls the new orders of Dominicans and Franciscans, because they weren't just monasteries and they weren't just active in the world. And so he's caught up in this universe again. 6 pages discussing, which is the highest life of all, and have I chosen the highest life of all, and is this the most solitude and the most contemplation I can get? And he goes through a big discussion and finally says, well, it looks like when Thomas says, we should be handing over, the fruits of contemplation, contemplata tradere, that even the mixed life is only the best. And of course, since St. Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican, he made sure that the mixed life was the best, because his life is the best, just like St. Francis said, Franciscans are the best, or St. Bonaventure, so everybody's order is the best, of course. Everybody's religion is the best, everybody's country is the best. This is the kind of stuff we got to get away from. But that's when you're engaged with your culture and your institution and your own ego, you can't get past that. But he says, so the reason it's the best is because it has just as much contemplation. The final, what was his final reflection there? If you can find it. So what this means in practice is that there's only one vocation, and this is good, this is true. I think. There's only one vocation, whether you teach or live in the cloister or nurse the sick, whether you're in religion or out of it, in religious life in other words, married or single, no matter who you are, what you are, you were called to the summit of perfection. Okay, that's the vocabulary of the time. You are called to a deep interior life, perhaps even to mystical prayer, amen to that, and to pass the fruits of your contemplation on to others, amen to that. And if you cannot do so by word, then by example. Well, I think that can stand, as it is. But he goes through this whole tortured 6-page reflection on, on how you get there, using the vocabulary and the categories of his own time. And this solo beatitude keeps coming back. And this, I'll close especially with this, the epilogue, the very last phrases of the 7-story mountain. Always going back to this desire for solitude. This really struck me this time, going back this time to Merton, is his early insistence and preoccupation and obsession with solitude. What's the most solitary I can be? Where is that coming from? There's a lot of psychological stuff going on with that, I'm convinced. And one of the really good books I read about that, I'll be referring back to it again in these 3 nights, is Journeys into Emptiness, by a person I know personally, Robert Jingen Gunn, who's a psychologist and a Zen practitioner. He had Journeys into Emptiness. Dogen, who's the founder of Japanese Zen Buddhism in the 13th century. Merton, and Carl Jung, and the quest for transformation. Journeys into Emptiness. And he has some very fascinating reflections, which I'll refer to, especially tomorrow, on Merton's personal psychology. But solitude is a really tricky thing. It's O beata solitudo, solo beatitudo, O blessed solitude, soul beatitude. Wow, who? Who says that, and why? One of the monks I knew actually had on his, he was long gone, but he actually had on his preview, Sartre, hell is other people. Well, if that's where you're coming from, to be solitary, wow. So you've got to be really careful. What is this desire for solitude? My own Carthusan Father General wrote a treatise for the order, almost like a Carthusan encyclical, on the levels of solitude once, and I was really impressed by it. There's solitude as a point of observance of the order, of the, which is a really low level. I'm doing it because it's part of the rule, and it's always penance, which is even worse. Second, separation. That's what solitude is, separation, and that's not, a very profound view. You separate from the world, but why? As hell as other people? And of course, you're not separated from this world in here. So, why? And third one was kind of like this sense of superiority. He quoted, Job, who was so righteous in his proclamation of his innocence, solitary on his dung heap, which is an interesting approach of level of solitude. But that ultimately, the deepest level is sharing the solitude of God. And I think Merton would agree with that at that stage of his life particularly. But the way that's often been interpreted is that God is solitary because he's God and separate from everything else. I don't think that's what that means. Or, even worse, God is neglected by people, constantly in the world, so he's alone. I don't think God's psychology works that way. But ultimately, as we'll see, and we'll see in Merton as well, God's solitude means, and our solitude means that we're at a level of depth, that we're immediately and directly connected with everyone and everything in the universe. So the very opposite of the solitude we think, when we're egotistically yearning for solitude. So anyway, I found even more than previously in my return to Merton this time that this obsession with solitude is very strange. Anyway, that's what the final epilogue is about, and we'll see how that moves us into tomorrow. And this is in italics, and he's like God speaking to him, if you'll remember. I will give you what you desire. I will lead you into solitude. I will lead you by the way that you cannot possibly understand, because I want it to be the quickest way. And that's what God did. Beyond what he expected or could. So. Therefore, all the things around you will be armed against you, to deny you, to hurt you, to give you pain, and therefore to reduce you to solitude. He had his persecutions, but the main problem is within us. And it says, everything that touches you will burn you, and you will draw your hand away in pain until you have withdrawn yourself from all things, and then you will be all alone. Really? Just before that, he had said, talking about, this sounds a little bit like St. Augustine, about finding God in things and above things. He says, the created things, they tell me something about you, that you are far from them, even though you are in them. Well, which is it? Far from them or in them? You have made them, and your presence sustains their being, and they hide you from me. Really? And I would live alone, out of them, o beata solitudo. For I knew that it was only by leaving them that I could come to you. And that is why I've been so unhappy when you seem to be condemning me to remain in them. I'm beginning to understand. You have taught me and have consoled me, and I've begun again to hope and to learn. So anyway, then he goes on. And this shows his conflict about being famous and being a writer. God says, you will be praised and it will be like being burned at the stake. You will be loved and will murder your heart and drive you into the desert. I think he's conflicted. You will have gifts and they will break you with their burden. You will have pleasures of prayer and they will sicken you and you will fly from them. Yes, he spoke earlier about being tempted by the pleasures of prayer. And I'll come back to John of the Cross in a second. Was that? So when you have been praised a little and loved a little, I will take away all your gifts and all your love and all your praise, and you will be utterly forgotten and abandoned, and you will be nothing. A dead thing, a rejection. And on that day you will begin to possess the solitude you have so long desired. Your solitude will bear immense fruit in the souls of men you will never see on earth. And this part is what's really interesting. Do not ask when it will be, or where it will be, or how it will be. That's true enough. On a mountain, or in a prison, in a desert, or in a concentration camp, or in a hospital, or in Gethsemane, does not matter. So don't ask me, because I'm not going to tell you. I'll leap unto the unknown. Huh? You will not know until you are in it. True enough. But you shall taste the true solitude of my anguish and my poverty, and I shall lead you into the high places of my joy. And you shall die in me and find all things in my mercy, which has created you for this end, and brought you from Prodes to Bermuda, to St. Antonin, to Oakham, to London, to Cambridge, to Rome, to New York, to Columbia, to Corpus Christi, to St. Bonaventure, to the Cistercian Abbey of the poor men who labor in Gethsemane, that you may become the brother of God, and learn to know the Christ of the burnt men. Well, people have often remarked, burnt men, that's how he died. Intriguingly enough, but we'll see more about that burning tomorrow. There was never any danger that Merton would get stuck in this. He was way too restless a spirit and way too mystical a soul. So there was no way that he would get stuck here the way maybe even most people do in that third level of faith, in that first stage of life when you've got everything well defined. In fact, the very last phrase in Latin at the end of that is "Sit finis libri, non finis quaerenti," which means, let this be the end of the book, but not the end of seeking. So that's, if you like, the pledge and the guarantee that he's going to continue growing. And it'll be a way that he can't predict or control, as we just heard. God promised in his words, as Merton imagined them, that it will be in a way you don't understand, at a time and a place you can't guess. And that's true of all of us. We will continue our journey if we're open enough to it, but it won't be in a way we can predict or control. And that's what happened to Merton as the 1950s started, and we'll see that tomorrow. And one final thing from St. John of the Cross. He speaks about the defects of beginners. As we just saw, the pleasures of prayer. He says, kind of like the sins of lust or greed, works out. They fall into many imperfections which come to them beginners with respect to this on account of the sweetness which they find at first in spiritual exercises. For many of these, lured by the sweetness and pleasure which they find in such exercises, strive more after spiritual sweetness than after spiritual purity and discretion. Big temptation. Or pride is what we see about, making sweeping judgments about the fate of New York and all that other stuff. It increases the fervor they have, and the devil knows that these works and virtues which they perform, they become vices. None appear good save themselves, and thus in deed and word, whenever the opportunity occurs, they condemn and slander others, beholding the mote in their brother's eye, not considering the beam in their own. They strain at another's gnat, and themselves swallow a camel. So that's at least a danger of religious people, as we see the Pharisees in the Gospel too. It's a very beautiful journey to go to this level of depth in the spiritual life and have all these wonderful graces and calling, and we all have it in our unique way, but don't be trapped there. Don't get stuck in all the beauty. It's only the first stage, only stage one. And we'll see how Merton progressed painfully through the next stage tomorrow, if you're ready for it. So again, questions, comments, discussions? We continue. Yes.
The idea of solitude seems very much in contrast to Jesus.
Yeah, it's true. It's true, yeah. Because Jesus, of course, sought out solitude at night and prayed all night to God, as it says several times, and he was alone. So if Jesus needed to do it, we probably do too. But it wasn't a lifestyle for him. Yeah. And, so it is a very odd choice, and having made that choice, lived that choice for 22 years, I can confirm that it's a very odd choice, and that most of the time, if not all the time, there are psychological reasons for it as well. We'll discuss those more tomorrow, too. Yes?
I thought I read somewhere that later in life, he was not really very happy with some of the things that he expressed in the seven-story.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
He did it publicly?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. So, I mean, because he did grow, and we'll see that over the next 2 days, he was able to look back and say, okay, wow, some of that stuff I really wouldn't write today, and I'm a little embarrassed about. So, yeah, that's to his credit. To his credit, he realized that, that was only the first step in the journey. But as I say, it's of interest because there are many people who do stop there, and they kind of stop growing beyond that, out of fear or whatever places. Yes?
It almost strikes me though that there seems to be a need for a quest for solitude, at least in the beginning of a religious life. Jesus himself, the story is that he went out into the desert.
Right, at the very beginning.
And
Sort of St. Paul.
I think of someone like St. Francis who went into solitude, was hanging out in the cemetery, the caves there at the beginning.
St. Ignatius of Loyola.
Yeah, in that rest. And
There's a need for a desert experience, yeah.
And Benedict himself, he seemed to go off by himself, St. Benedict, and then attracted followers around him who became more active.
But none of those people stayed in solitude.
But there seems to be a need for, at least in the beginning, some kind of solitary experience.
Yeah, and the reason is, and Richard Rohr points this out too, the reason is that we need to separate from not only our home and the culture and the stuff that we can become too easily identified with, we have to separate from our usual support system, our usual identities, our masks, our roles, all the things that we define us in society. We need to go into the desert to see, well, who am I beyond that, or before that, or apart from that? Whereas then people would say, what was your face before you were born? It's a way of saying, who are you really before and beyond all that? So solitude as a way, as a tool for experiencing that is, I think, not only permissible, but essential in everyone's life at some point. So I agree, yes.
Is it something you have to go back to periodically too?
Depends on the person. Yes. Yes.
What would you say about the present Pope in our day? It seems to me that he has a different approach in expressing the holy way in which he celebrates the Eucharist, how he does very good ways of dealing with people in a large crowd in a cathedral, and then when he comes out, he also goes with them and spends some time with them. And I think he's coming here soon. And do you think that will in some way show itself too?
Well, I'm not going to make a lecture about Pope Francis, but to relate it to what we're talking about tonight, I think his openness to the world and to the struggles of the world and the struggles of ordinary people is something that Merton evinced in his later life very much, and which is part of spiritual maturity. So, to that extent, it's an important feature of how we do evolve, should evolve spiritually, however it actually manifests itself. Yes.
For those of us who were growing up with Thomas Merton in the 50s, I would say, as a child.
Yeah.
And then after, and this 30-year journey that will take over 3 nights, I can't think of another quote-unquote priest who's written the way he's written, who's general world, and all of us in this room are not part of the general world.
Yeah,
Because we're not at the tribal religion stage, as Richard Rohr would say.
yeah.
So we have the gift of this man's life that I cannot think of another author for the general informed public.
No, I agree. That's why he's such an important figure. And, I mean, in a sense, he couldn't help himself. He had to write everything he was thinking and feeling. That's just who he was for various reasons, both as a calling and as a psychological need. But that's his value. You know, he really just let it all hang out, and we can follow in his drama our own drama. You know, our own story, and our own hang-ups and our own struggles. You know, are mirrored there. And it's a great gift to us that he was so open and honest, and that he was able to share that with all of us. Yes. You want to see us then?
I would think that if you stayed in solitude, you could never see if you developed maturity or virtue or whatever if you're not rubbing shoulders with other people.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's no proof. There's no proof of how.
It's only in community that you see who you are.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, let's be honest. Well, okay, but he was in community. And you do see the way you treat your brothers and sisters. And there's something St. Teresa of Lisieux was very eloquent about, you know, how she treated the sister at the laundry who irritated her, you know, was a key to measuring her spiritual progress. And that's true of us too. Whether you bark at somebody at the office or in the checkout line or in the car, you know, it's an indication of how transformed you are. But yeah, you've got to have some kind of check. You've got to have some kind of somebody to bounce off. Anyone else? Okay, well, thank you for being here tonight, and I know not all of you can come back tomorrow, but I hope you come and find out what's next.